So my name's Natalie King and I live in Surrey with my husband and my two boys. In 2015, I had my second son, Miles, who was a happy, healthy baby, following a very difficult birth. When he was 7 weeks old, we put him to bed as normal. He went to sleep. He was already a really good sleeper. And he woke up in the middle of the night, just after midnight, very unsettled. After a few hours, we noticed that he was making a sound which sounded a little bit like straining. It was very similar to a sound that he made nearly every morning, which was like gas. You know, he was a newborn baby. We didn't really think anything of that. But then when I went to change his nappy, once it was a little bit lighter and I put the lights on, I noticed that his skin was a sort of grey tone. And that's when alarm bells started to ring for me. I couldn't explain that, and I wasn't happy to wait to go to the GP because they weren't open yet, and so I decided to take him straight to hospital. And I remember the doctor coming and taking all his clothes off and asking me how long he'd had like a tiny purple spot under his arm, and I hadn't even noticed it up to that point. And that was the first time that they said, you know, we think that that could be meningitis, we're not sure, but we're going to treat him with antibiotics just in case. As they gave him antibiotics and they gave him fluid, that purple pinprick mark then turned into a rash, a purple rash that almost entirely covered his body. And as they explained, that was septicemia. He was transferred to Southampton General Hospital, where at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he went into cardiac arrest very quickly, very suddenly, and the doctors couldn't bring him back from that, and unfortunately he died at 3 o'clock the same day. The grief is a pain like no other, and I think all parents would agree. I remember leaving the hospital with very little support from the hospital staff, and driving home from Southampton and just feeling you're just plunged into a world that you don't understand. You can't understand what's just happened around you. You can't understand why you're going home without a child when you've gone into hospital with a child. And also feeling very angry. You know, we were driving home and you can see everybody going about their normal lives. So I remember feeling just complete shock and bewilderment and anger at the world that actually our life had stopped and the world was just carrying on. I had a lot of feelings of wondering if I was going to be good enough for my older child. You know, I felt extreme guilt having failed Miles. You know, was there more that I could have done? Should I have taken him to the hospital sooner? So it was just a real mixture of emotions, and the grief did change. You know, it did change from anger and shock to guilt, to just general sadness and wondering if life is ever going to feel the same again. Because Miles was only a couple of months old, and because he wasn't previously ill or anything, he died very quickly after being taken into hospital. They did a child death review. So we were assigned someone from the NHS who worked as part of the child death review team who would visit us to go over the details of what had happened. It didn't feel like we were being tested or judged or anything. We knew that they were doing that review to make sure that everything was done correctly at the hospital and things like that. So the child death review went on sort of behind the scenes, really. We didn't have to go anywhere. We didn't have to get involved. And then, of course, we had to arrange a funeral. And I think, you know, if you arrange a funeral for an older person, you're very aware that you want it to be a celebration of their life and things like that. But it feels very different when it's a young child because they haven't been with you for very long. So everything feels very wrong about planning a funeral for your child. I would say the two key things that helped at the time when we lost Miles was talking to an independent grief counsellor, someone that we didn't know, someone who didn't judge us, and it was her job. She knew the right things to say, and she was able to tell us that what we were experiencing was normal. She could listen to our very dark thoughts, what we were feeling, what we were thinking, and tell us that that was a normal way to be. because it didn't feel very normal at all at the time. It was really important to talk to the Meningitis Research Foundation. I feel like I had a lot of unanswered questions in my head about meningitis and why Miles had died, and what it all did to the body, why he didn't present with symptoms that I thought he should have. And they were, they provided me with a lot of information to help me process those questions and move forward. They allowed me to come to seminars with doctors and meet the doctors that were doing the research and things like that. And all of that was really key in me and my coping mechanisms and processing all those unanswered questions that I had in my head. And my oldest son, Tristan, was nearly 2, not quite 2, when Miles was born or when Miles died. Tristan obviously played on my mind a huge amount. Having to break that news to him, he was very aware that Miles wasn't there anymore. He would ask questions at very random times, but as a toddler, we could be playing Lego and he could be talking about that, and then he'd suddenly say something about Miles and it would shock us, and then he'd just go back and play Lego again. The counsellor told us that we had to be really brutally honest about death with Tristan, and it goes completely against what you want to do with young people and young children. You don't want to tell your young child all about death and what dead means and things. You want to keep them in a bubble for a really long time, but here we found ourselves in a situation where we had to explain to our 2-year-old what being dead meant, and being very honest about Miles being dead. It was a difficult thing to do, but when I look back, I know that it was the right thing to do. Tristan can and has always been able to talk to us about death and how he's felt about Miles. He can be open and honest about it. When he has questions, he asks us those questions, and we can be honest with our answers to him. Since I had Miles, I've had another boy. So Elliot is 3 now, but when I became pregnant with Elliot, it was nearly 2 years after I'd lost Miles, because it had taken that long for me to even consider thinking about another baby. So the pregnancy with Elliot, so my 3rd boy, was difficult. It was physically, I was fine, but mentally I worried about everything. So when Elliot was a newborn, I struggled quite a lot in terms of my mental health. I felt like I didn't feel very attached emotionally to Elliot. I felt that I just worried that I would lose him. So I thought if I didn't get too attached to him, and if I lost him, it wouldn't be so bad. But when I look back now, I think that sounds crazy. But at the time, I was just so, the grief of Miles came back again. And, when I saw Elliot, I thought of Miles. So then I struggled at night time to fall asleep for quite a period of time. What I would do is I'd go to bed, and at night I would go through and think about all the things that I'd done with the children and all the things that could have gone wrong. And it was a very dark place to be. It was only when I spoke to a counsellor that she said that's the sort of thing that that PTSD presents as. Thinking over and over again about Miles at the hospital, and how he died in the hospital, and then relating that to my children and how they might die. We talk about Miles a lot less now, but we still, we have anniversaries. So we celebrate what would have been Miles's birthday by going to a park where we've got a memorial bench. And I think that's really important. Tristan always gets involved in planning that, in getting the balloons and doing cards for him, which he really enjoys. And that gives us an opportunity to talk to Miles as well, or to talk to Tristan about Miles. My advice for anyone that's struggling with their mental health is to try and be open with the people closest to them about how they're feeling, even if they cannot, they don't have the right things to say at the time. If they know how you're feeling, they can be there for you, to try and pick you up, to offer support, even if it's in practical terms, or try and find some other specialist support for you. If you can take time out for yourself to clear your mind outside, that's really helpful.